So Shana Tova, Shana Tova. The intent of my reflections tonight is to point outwards towards things going on around us, to frame our situation a little as we move into the year 5785. And of course, there's no way I could touch on everything, so don't worry. But so much in our world is in flux at this moment. It really does feel like our high holiday prayers. On Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed. Who shall live on and who shall not? Who by fire and who by water? Who by sword and who by beast? Who by hunger and who by thirst? Who dwells in peace and who is uprooted? Who shall live safely and who shall be harmed? Whose life is tranquil and whose is tormented? Who shall be poor and who shall be rich? Who shall be humbled and who is raised up? So much seems to lie in the balance. Threats to democracy, disinformation and misinformation, war and peace, climate change, social and economic inequality, political and economic instability, migration caused by all of the above. It astounds me that this week America experienced a hurricane that was so powerful that it cut off whole areas of the country from communication, not just areas by the coast, but areas far inland and presumably protected from hurricanes. To me, it was a reminder of how quickly our technologically dependent society can be blasted back a century, and climate change will continue to change our calculations going forward. And there's much more basic assumptions about our reality that are shifting. Perceptions of truth, history, facts or not facts, understandings of justice and due process of law. Is a president in America above the law, for example? Is the right of the vote sacrosanct or up for sale? Housing in America was never considered a right, but now it is an investment commodity, which is simply pricing the average person out of home ownership altogether. The year 5784, now just ending, may well be remembered in Jewish history for centuries. For anyone with a sense of history, we are living through a time when everything seems to be in the balance. In our small setting here, I'm not looking to make these comments into a lecture on the nature of the world we cannot change, but I do know that we live in a media environment. We are hearing things all the time about Israel, about Jews, about America, about the state of the world, and we ourselves find ourselves at times as American Jews representing things to others around us that we do not even recognize. We are hearing our world described for others in ways that seem to incorporate other people's assumptions into our experience. Now, I have more questions than answers, but I think it is important that we find ways to share the perspectives that we have rooted in our particular American Jewish experience. There was, of course, just at the beginning of this past year, on Shmini Atzeret, Simchat Torah, just after Rosh Hashanah last year, the attacks of October 7th by Hamas. These attacks were reminiscent of the anti-Semitic riots and pogroms that peoples around us would inflict upon us at will in the years before the state of Israel existed. And without the organized power of a state, the Jewish people could do little in response but pray, write poetry, and beg others to protect us. But this time, with the power of a state, the response was overwhelming, horrendous, and calculated to let everyone know not to take Jewish life or Jewish responses to existential threats for granted. Simultaneously, we have been grateful that Jews in our era do not have to beg for permission to live, and horrified at the human suffering Israel's enemies believe is worthwhile to put others through in order to try to reverse that situation. We can question various specific actions by Israel or Israelis, and I do, but you cannot deny how determined many of Israel's enemies are to kill Jews and destroy Israel. When you see that Hamas decides it is better to see all of Gaza destroyed and over 40,000 Palestinians killed, rather than to release 100 or 200 hostages. Or when you see Hezbollah, whose name itself is a sacrilege, meaning party of God, who would put the security of Lebanon and the lives of all Lebanese at risk in order to maintain the privilege of shelling Israeli towns, fields, and villages with missiles and rockets. And then we have so many of the international organizations applying a form of higher anti-Semitism in the name of international law. Supranational organizations and non-governmental organizations, like those built around the networks of the United Nations, for decades have been working on a project of embedding human rights into international law, without taking into account the realities of the Middle East, and most particularly, without taking into account the reality of anti-Semitism. International law is built up slowly by precedent and resolutions over a period of decades. And most of the time since the creation of the State of Israel, those nations associated with the Arab world and the Islamic world, with Black Africa and the communist bloc and the non-aligned nations during the Cold War, all sided against Israel even before a question was asked. The United Nations Human Rights Council was chaired by Syria and enjoyed the full participation of the Islamic Republic of Iran, all while regularly condemning Israel more than any other country in the world. Add to that the vast majority of Western states who for decades were not going to act or vote in support of Israel because they did not want to have their supply of oil threatened by OPEC embargoes. And you have a situation where most of those creating international law were opposed to Israel for reasons that had nothing to do with the laws they were creating. These political realities regarding Israel, combined with other cultural and religious attitudes towards Jews, to create a rather toxic and anti-Semitic soup in much of the world and at the United Nations in particular. This is why the war in Gaza is so often characterized as Israel's war against Hamas, rather than Hamas's war against Israel. And as horrible as that war is, the world is focused on it so much more than it is or has been on so many more violent wars, such as in the Sudan, or what was the situation in Syria, as but two examples. And this is why the United Nations does not treat Hamas or Hezbollah as terrorist organizations, and claims that Israel was occupying Gaza before October 7th, rather than trying to protect itself from Hamas. On two separate occasions over the years, I watched and listened as two different U.S. ambassadors to the United Nations, Madeleine Albright and Samantha Power, described in some detail how the United Nations singles out Israel for systematic exclusion and criticism. The United Nations is so filled with both anti-Semitism and anti-Israel bias that Israelis do not take it seriously. But it is a mistake not to take the opinion of the international community seriously or to ignore international law. It is a strategic mistake for Israel to ignore international law because it will be used against them. And it is a moral mistake, because notwithstanding what the United Nations has done with international law, the effort itself is a worthy one. The world is a better place with international law than without it, or would be if those formulating international law would address the issue of anti-Semitism. Ignoring the issue of a two-state resolution, so Palestinians too can have communal self-determination, has also been a strategic and moral mistake. But October 7th and its aftermath has not done anything to speed up the day when we will see a Palestinian state. If anything, it will be a longer time now than it might have been. Especially as any time before October 7th, Palestinians could have decided to establish a peaceful civil state in Gaza that would have inevitably grown to include larger borders. But Hamas was ruling Gaza, and they were not and are not looking for a Palestinian state living in peace next to Israel. They are looking for a Palestinian state in place of Israel. As Thomas Friedman of the New York Times said years ago, for Palestinians to get a state of their own, they have to want to have a Palestinian state more than they want to destroy a Jewish state. Nonetheless, it was clear before October 7th that for Israel to ignore the question of a two-state solution was a strategic mistake and a moral failure. The commitment to international law is also akin to the commitment of many Western-oriented nations to democracy. As we gather this Erev Rosh Hashanah, democracy is hanging in the balance. Before October 7th, Israel was undergoing its own fight about democracy. And at some point, it may again have the luxury of returning to that controversy. Here in the United States, democracy is on the ballot. In Europe as well, democracy is in the balance. The far right figures prominently in the governments of Italy, Hungary, Finland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Croatia, Sweden, and the Netherlands, and prominently in the politics of France, Austria, and Germany. The most well-developed attack on democracy in the European Union has been conducted in Hungary by Viktor Orban, who became prime minister in 2010 and has since practically destroyed whatever political mechanisms might have existed to unseat him. In the past couple of years, Orban has attended a number of significant American political functions as well, and has established a close relationship with some American political figures. This year, I voted for the first time in European elections, and just last week in the Austrian parliamentary elections. Obviously, I voted by absentee ballot, and one small but principled difference struck me both times. When I vote by mail in Pennsylvania, I have to pay to vote. I have to put a stamp on the envelope. When I vote in Austrian elections, they are insistent in very big letters. I should not put postage on the envelope. Wherever I am, whatever country I'm in, they will pay the international postage so that each voter can vote without payment. From this, it might seem that the Austrian government is more concerned about voting rights than the government in Pennsylvania, even though democracy as a form of government goes back much further in time here in Pennsylvania than in Austria. In fact, I remember about 8 years ago, the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg hosted a talk by the German Consulate General to New York. He began his talk noting how he had grown up within communist East Germany, which itself came about after the Nazi era, and that he always felt the need when talking to Americans to thank the United States for giving to Germany their democratic heritage. Yet very recently, the far-right party in Germany won a state parliamentary election. And in Austria's elections this past Sunday, the far-right party for the first time won the largest single block of votes, 29%. For context, the center-right People's Party gained 26%, the center-left Social Democrats 21%, and the Greens 8%. So it will be up to these parties to determine if they will enter into any form of coalition with the far right. The Associated Press says of this far right party, founded by former Nazis, quite literally, and wrongly named the Austrian Freedom Party. It describes it saying, in its election program titled Fortress Austria, the Freedom Party calls for re-migration of uninvited foreigners, for achieving a more homogeneous nation by tightly controlled borders and suspending the right to asylum via emergency law. They also express views far more favorable to Putin than to Ukraine. It is strange how in our day the Nazis and the former communists come together in their efforts. And strange also, these are very familiar themes in our American context, where we have elections in which mail-in voting is already underway. But the elections themselves are not what I'm talking about tonight. The questions are about after the elections. Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism, writes a lot about democracy. Reconstructionism, more than any form of Judaism, is very much an American adaptation of Judaism. Other forms of Judaism, Reform, Conservative, Orthodoxy, or Hasidic, began their development in Europe in response to some encounter with modernity, and were transplanted here. Reconstructionism, as a formulation of Jewish life and practice, specifically began as a Jewish response to modernity within an American cultural and intellectual context. Democracy, therefore, had a particular place for Mordechai Kaplan as a religious value. Democracy as a religious value, since ultimately democracy is rooted in fundamental assumptions about the meaning of community and human dignity. Democracy is about how we structure community, society, and governance. How do we have social order while recognizing the dignity of the individual? How do we have community without coercion? This is ultimately a religious question because affirming human dignity is ultimately a core religious value. In Jewish language, each human being is made in the divine image. In American language, each human being is endowed by the Creator with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, built, of course, on the words of Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke, who themselves were teasing these formulations out of their own wrestles with religion and the clash of tradition with modernity. In the course of history, democracy ultimately is not a question separate from religion. It grows out of religious struggle. William Penn in Pennsylvania, Roger Williams in Rhode Island. Democracy grows out of the religious struggle to affirm personal expression as a form of individual dignity while also maintaining social order. Perhaps by letting authority grow out of a sense of covenant entered into by individuals. In certain parts of the world where religion still endorses coercion, like Afghanistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia, democracy does not exist at all. In other parts of the world where there is no sense among the powerful that human dignity demands individual freedom of expression, such as China or Russia, democracy also does not exist. Where do we, in America, root a commitment to human dignity? Maybe one reason that democracy is so challenged today is because few of its supporters are thinking of it as a religious question. We have forgotten that democracy is an issue of human dignity, and in the public square, we have forgotten the value of human dignity. In order to have democracy, you must have some assertion that the lives of individual human beings matter, that human rights matter. But where do we find that assertion? Certainly not in the halls and boardrooms of corporate capitalism, which is not at all concerned with such issues. Human dignity is not a priority of the free market. Human dignity is ultimately a religious question, but in most democratic societies today, religion is considered functionally irrelevant on the public square. For many, religion is considered necessarily coercive. So those who see religion as necessarily coercive, abandon not only religious answers, but even religious questions, not bothering to think about those questions or about religion. Meanwhile, in America, we have growing forms of Christian nationalism who seek to impose values and practices upon society based on literalist interpretations of religious scripture. This does not naturally lead to support of democratic decision-making in society. Simply put, if you already know God's will, then rejecting that will simply because a majority of the country wants to reject it is an abomination, a blasphemy. We've heard, "Thou shalt not follow the majority into evil." So if you believe that you know what the world should be, regardless of what anybody else thinks, democracy does not matter, can be an obstacle. Where are we as American Jews in all of this? Jews were hardly present here in the time of Roger Williams or William Penn. But when Jews were forced out of their communities by a whole series of European public policy decisions, the question of how to be Jewish in this new context became front and center. How can we reconstitute or reconstruct Jewish community in what was literally for us a new world? Democracy became a religious issue for Jews just as it was for everyone living in the West. In addition to seeing support of democracy as a religious imperative for the society at large, Mordechai Kaplan also began to explore ways for Jewish community to be restructured internally along democratic principles. This is where Reconstructionist Judaism's approach to community, covenant, and governance is based. We here represent a particular American Jewish legacy, an amalgam of values that the world needs to know. From an American context, a concern for individual autonomy rooted in a conception of human dignity, growing out of the Enlightenment. And from a Jewish context, a concern for communal responsibility, also rooted in a conception of human dignity, but a conception of human dignity that grows out of a Jewish ethos of mutual commitment, a conviction that Kol Yisrael Aravim Zeh Lazeh, all Jews are part of each other and are responsible for each other. All people are part of each other and responsible for each other. One is a conception of individual human rights. The other is a conception of mutual mitzvah, binding obligation. Human rights and mutual mitzvah. These are but some of the issues that hang in the balance. In the face of these and so many other pressing issues, we are called upon to find ways, literally, to be more ourselves, to be more us, more our amalgam of American and Jewish, concerned about human dignity rooted in both human rights and mutual mitzvah. We're called upon to find ways to be more ourselves as we enter into this new year, as we think about, speak about, and deal with these issues. Shana Tova.